Thank you very much, Guillermo. And good afternoon, compañeros and compañeras. I am so happy to be able to participate in this opportunity to reflect on this very serious point in human history. I would like to begin by placing what Ricardo just said during his remarks, and we also heard this from João Pedro and also Fernando Edad said about whether this is actually a new Cold War, what we are witnessing in today's world and what the international press in 2019 called a trade war. Or is it really a threat or an ideological offensive by the United States against China within the context of profound change in the world economy and world system? Ricardo put up a very good argument in terms of the fact that there are no longer two poles in this conflict. Rather, that's a trap. We should not fall into the trap of calling this a new Cold War because there are no longer two poles. Rather, there is a strategy being waged by the United States that is very well coordinated and is an ideological one. I would like to bring in another element along those same lines. In addition to the fact that there are not two poles within this dispute, that is to say, two poles that are willing to engage in conflict, but rather it is a unilateral strategy, nor is there a balance of powers, either economic, scientific, technological, or military powers. This is also changing profoundly. What am I trying to say? In the recent years, and now this is a process that predates the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis, but we have been seeing a systematic, permanent weakening of the United States economy. Secondly, we are also witnessing a weakening of local conditions for scientific and technological production in various areas within the United States. And thirdly, if we observe how military expenditure is done worldwide, we see that the United States uh, still accounts for about fell from 50% to 33 or 38% of global military spending. And so it's in a different position vis-a-vis the emerging countries, also within the same sphere. So we see that even as what João Pedro was talking about in the area of military technology and military firepower, in which the United States still has unquestionable supremacy, the process is leading towards a significant change in that regard as well. So what I would like to say for you to uphold that central idea, and I would like to discuss it with all of you, is the weakening of the economy of both the United States and Europe, which began perhaps around 2008 and never recovered in the subsequent years. It was a deep crisis 2008, but neither the United States nor Europe were able to truly recover from that crisis and entered the 2020 crisis in an economically weakened position. So in the case of the United States, through 2019, the United States was had one of the 15 largest public debt rates in the world. So with the funds that the U.S. set aside to fight the COVID-19 crisis in 2020, it probably went from 13th to one of the 10 most highly publicly indebted countries on the planet.
An interesting thing here is that the international debt, who are the main creditors worldwide? China is the second creditor of the US in terms of the public debt. Second place, we can think about unemployment rates, both in the US and in Europe. They are the highest ever since the Second World War. They have never been so high ever since then. And this, of course, will have an impact in 2021 and 22. Even the domestic situation, domestic conflicts, and situations in the US. What happened some days ago in the Capitol also shows the fragility, even of democracy, which was presented as an example. It shows us how politically fragile the system in the US is. A third element along the same lines is the incapacity the US has shown in terms of controlling the COVID 19 pandemic. And we all know that any possibility of economic recovery has to do with controlling the pandemic at the national, regional, and international level. This possibility depends on the vaccine and a process of immunization that must be universal. And along the same lines of the weakening of the US economy and in the areas of science and technology. Before 2019, we saw this, and it has only accelerated in 2020. There's been a strengthening of emergent Asian economies and a strengthening specifically of the Chinese economy. Data shows us that the new route of silk worked much more than we thought. So provisions have been overcome for several reasons. First of all, for a growth of the domestic market in China, which had as a consequence that China managed to eliminate poverty even before their foresight. They've expanded internal market and strengthening the relationships also with between China and Africa and the different Asian countries based on the Pacific relations that had been stated in previous conferences. And this is important to recover right now. These are principles that point towards the collaboration, the non intervention, sovereignty, a world of peace. These are fundamental principles. So when China goes back to these principles of peaceful coexistence, which are also in the 80s mentioned as included as constitutional goals of their foreign policy, and they are taken up again in their relations with Africa, China shows us a different historic horizon of this new world order that's emerging right now and accelerating in its deeper changes in the context of this COVID 19 crisis. Now, the new project, this project of the new Silk Road, that's reconfiguring the scenario, they're in a space of collaboration, bringing closer together Europe and Asia in different spheres, including technologic and diplomacy. This also brings China closer to Latin America in a very clear way. Of the more than 100 countries that are part of the Memorandum of Understanding of the New Silk Road, there are many Latin American countries included. Argentina will be the country number 119 to be included in this agreement. And if we see the predictions of recovery, of economic recovery of all of the agencies, including the World Bank and IMF, they may not like to acknowledge this, but the the bigger growth rates will be from China and India. So as Joao Pedro mentioned at the beginning of his exposition, what will drive the recovery of world economy? Will it be the US? Will it be Europe? No, all of the data shows us that it will be Asia, the emergent Asian countries, and specifically China and India. In this context, I think that if we go over all of this data, the economy, the US economy, is very, very weakened, and the material basis to continue on with this policy of intervention in our region, intervention worldwide, have weakened. Is it an ideological discourse? Yes. Is it an offensive, an attack? Yes, but they have less and less capacity to have guaranteed the material basis for these attacks and their interventions in the political and diplomatic processes. And I'd like to share with you three large, very important failures of the US in the last few years. In the first place, the conflict for 5G technology. The whole of 2019 and the so-called commercial war, which was taken as a concept and spread by international media, this was based on what was called the commercial war against China. This began the conflict on the competition for 5G technology. This is a wireless technology that the US does not control entirely, while China does. And it has the potential to impact on the new modes of production, the technology of things, including having self driven cars, a new horizon in public and private transportation. And the set of sanctions, a set of attacks that the US has pointed towards Huawei, which was one of the main leader companies on the use of 5G technology, this also failed. The US pressured all of the Latin American countries very greatly, including mainly Brazil, to refuse to use or come into contact with the Huawei company. And even though a few months ago the United Kingdom said they would not accept 5G technology, they had to go back on this because if they don't accept 5G technology, they will be left out of a new way, a new mode of technology that will be dominating the world. And we are going towards a 4.0 technological revolution. So being left out of this means being left out of any possibility to participate in the competition, in technological and scientific competition. So the US was unable to impose this level of isolation to China through their tactic of opposing Huawei and all of the different mechanisms to present 5G technology as a new technological horizon. The second failure, and here we have perhaps the entire ideological and diplomatic sphere of this, was the attempt of the US to forbid TikTok, social media that's today one of the most popular under the Trump administration. The US managed to introduce a legal prohibition for the companies that had an agreement with TikTok. And I believe this lasted less than 48 hours because the companies themselves reacted legally to counteract and eliminate this prohibition. And the third large failure is their own management of the pandemic in the US territory and the growing scientific collaboration that China has been working on worldwide to control not only the effects of the pandemic, the level of contagion, but also treatment and the vaccine itself. Just as President Xi Jinping mentioned 3 days ago in the Davos meeting, China has so far offered attention, collaboration with more than 100 countries in the world in order to 150 countries in order to counteract the advance of the pandemic. They have offered also technical support to the countries that needed it. So while the US has been isolating itself systematically and even abandoning the main space of coordination that they have, which is the World Health Organization, in the moment of greater crisis of the last 100 years in the planet, the US retreated from the WHO, and China has offered to cover the funds that the US wouldn't be providing anymore. So then we have a policy of isolation from the US followed by a policy of expansion in terms of collaboration and participation in the international spaces when it comes to China. And perhaps one of the more central aspects of the global agenda right now might be what China just mentioned January 25th in the Davos meeting towards the in President Xi Jinping's speech, which is the vaccine as a public good. What does this mean? It means to defend the vaccine from any attempt to profit, to turn the vaccine into yet another commodity. So I believe that this statement, the vaccine as a common good and the process of immunization worldwide as a priority of humanity are key. They are key, and they could even build an agenda of the progressive forces at the global level, an agenda for the defense of life and the fundamental values affirming the humanistic view and vision so that we may all exit this crisis together. So, this vaccine, of course, the idea of the vaccine as a public good goes against pharmaceutical companies worldwide. And this represents also the one and only possibility to exit the sanitary crisis. Because now, to be honest, we cannot think that the national control of the pandemic has any kind of incidence. The virus still is spread beyond any possibility to control it, beyond any possibility to prevent circulation between one country and another. There are new breeds coming up. They each become stronger or they have higher rates of contagion. So we cannot confront process of immunization as a national or even regional processes. We need to have a global immunization plan that's universal and that takes up the ideas shared by China's president on January 25th, who presented the vaccine again as a public good. So what we're seeing right now emerging in this new world system where development and economic dynamism is being displaced from the north, the developed north, to the countries of the emerging countries of the south. And we can see this very clearly in China. So this is also a movement from the west to the east. And it's reconfiguring not only world economy, but also the new geopolitics that emerge from this process and which doesn't change with the COVID 19 crisis, but it does speed up. So, if we could see changes before very clearly and systematically in the last 12 months, they have accelerated and made it much more clear that the project of this capitalist model and its form of accumulation has failed in all of the spheres. The economic fear and its inability to recover economically, in demography and sanitary aspects because they were unable to control pandemic in their own territories, let alone start any kind of regional or international collaboration to overcome the pandemic, and in the ideological sphere. And the last thing I'd like to mention here is when it comes to Latin America.
It is very difficult for right wing and ultra right wing governments of the region that supported the United States hemispheric vision and its strategy vis-a-vis the rest of the world under Trump. And we'll see what happens with Biden. It's very difficult for the Latin American countries to subjugate themselves, and I'm talking about even the right wing governments, to this vision of the United States because the material base is much stronger. For example, what is happening in terms of the vaccine in a country such as Brazil? Brazil had an extremely hostile policy vis-a-vis the government of China, and at several points in time. In fact, it was even racist. But now it is clear that the government of Brazil has to rebuild its relations with China because China is not only one of the opportunities for the biggest source of vaccines in the world for people in throughout the country, but even the AstraZeneca vaccine, the one also has Chinese partners. Through this pandemic, we discovered that 95% of the personal protection equipment available throughout the world is produced in China. So it is impossible for even the most right wing governments to continue to support the United States hemispheric vision because the world has changed, because China has a new position, even in terms of diplomatic relations with the countries of Latin America. Starting in 2008, since then, China became the biggest trading partner of almost all of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is the main source of imports and exports. So even in 2013, when UNASUR, as Alicia said, was in full expansion and was discussing a strategy of using natural resources for the comprehensive integral development of our countries, uh, they didn't have a hegemonic view, but there was not a single view, but there was a view. There were even countries such as Colombia and Peru that were much more aligned with the United States, had to follow UNASUR. Now we're launching the Pacific Partnership in the United States as a way to create a system parallel to UNASUR that has moved forward very quickly, both politically and economically speaking. For example, this means that countries such as Chile stopped having trade negotiations with China because they were going to be part of the new Pacific Partnership with the United States. And this was totally unviable. China, which depends on copper exports and its main trading partner is China, could not stop trading copper with China because it was part of that trade agreement. So these are the kinds of examples I'm referring to in saying that this U.S. Offensive is more and more ideological and more removed from reality on the ground. And part of the weaknesses that the U.S. has in terms of seeing the consequences, it remains on the ideological level and threats, but they do not have the conditions to continue to carry it out. So, in this regard, Venezuela, and we must say this, represents the new Vietnam of the United States. For more than 20 years, the United States has been waging all kinds of warfare against the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, diplomatic war, economic war, and even threats of military invasion, intervention, all types of interference. But they did not achieve their objective, which was to overturn the Bolivarian government of Venezuela. It's the new Vietnam. It's the 21st century's Vietnam. Despite all of the serious impacts that they have had, as Ricardo was telling us, the objective was to bring down the Bolivarian government, and they have not been able to do it. So I think we're at a different moment in which the United States no longer has the economic strength, nor the scientific, nor technological capacity to put itself in a situation of once again having world hegemony. The Biden administration has part of the center of its agenda. Maybe there are two essential objectives: one, to control COVID-19 within its borders, and secondly, to regain the ground it had lost in the international sphere. But now China is in a much better position than it was in 2019. With the U.S. economy is much weaker. It has a much bigger public debt, and it has very serious domestic problems in terms of extreme poverty and poverty that are rising at unprecedented levels in the United States in terms of unemployment. And their partners in Europe are also weakened. So the world is definitely different. And for Latin America, this certainly poses an historic opportunity to develop a strategic relationship with China and to have a new type of South-South relations with emerging countries. Brazil has played a very important role before in the BRICS and virtually withdrew from it because formally it is still part of it, but Brazil withdrew from a dynamic role in the BRICS, but they could take it up again if there's a change in government. But this affects all of Latin America. This was clear under President Lula and also under President Dilma. And every BRICS meeting, at these, they invited other countries to participate in these discussions because Brazil was clear that Brazil's participation in the BRICS meetings, that they were doing this on behalf of our entire region. To wrap up, I'd just like to say that the relationship with China includes this strategic dimension for Latin America. What's happening at this point in time, what we are seeing regionally, is to replace a relationship of dependence on China. We've become our main import-export partner. This can and must change because the white paper on China's policy for Latin America that was approved in 2008 and was reworked in 2014 offers an opportunity for this win-win relationship that is offered as a central element of Chinese policy vis-a-vis the rest of the world should take on new forms with Latin America, the possibility of industrializing natural resources and not simply exporting raw materials without added value, to have technology transfer and scientific cooperation. We must take advantage of these opportunities in our countries, but this can only be done if the progressive forces of the people are capable of putting together a new political agenda for our region, a new agenda and a new project for national and regional development, taking up the heresy of the first 15 years of the 21st century of regional integration from a perspective of sovereignty and self-determination, and also with free thinking and sovereign view of the future that is possible for our region in the new international context, with all of the potential that this offers, but also in light of the threats that are still our great challenges. Thank you very much.